In 1962, federal investigators discovered 47 shallow graves scattered across a 300-acre compound in rural Oregon, each containing multiple bodies showing signs of malnutrition and systematic abuse. The corpses were arranged in perfect circles around makeshift altars, with children's remains placed at the center. Medical examiners found evidence of prolonged psychological torture, forced sterilizations, and deliberate starvation. Most disturbing were the detailed journals recovered from the site, documenting a methodical process of spiritual purification that had been operating undetected for over 2 decades. The Eternal Light Sanctuary first appeared in the records of Cascade County, Oregon, in March 1940. Father Marcus Whitmore, a charismatic preacher from Pennsylvania, had purchased 300 acres of isolated farmland with what local officials described as substantial private funding. The deed, filed at the county courthouse, listed the property as a religious retreat center for spiritual rehabilitation. Whitmore arrived in the valley with impeccable credentials. Born in 1895 to a wealthy Philadelphia family, he had studied theology at Princeton Seminary and served as a missionary in South America for 15 years. His letters of recommendation came from prominent religious leaders across the East Coast, praising his dedication to bringing lost souls back to the light of Christ. The local newspaper, the Cascade Valley Herald, ran a glowing profile of the new arrival in April 1940. Reporter Margaret Sullivan described Whitmore as a man of profound spiritual conviction who had sacrificed a comfortable life in the city to serve those forgotten by society. The article mentioned his plans to establish a haven for troubled families seeking redemption. Within months, the sanctuary began attracting its first residents. They came in family units, usually arriving by night in covered trucks that bore no license plates. The locals noticed but said nothing. These were desperate people, the newspaper explained, families torn apart by alcoholism, domestic violence, or financial ruin. They sought shelter and spiritual guidance from Father Whitmore's proven methods. By 1942, the sanctuary housed approximately 60 residents across 12 families. They lived in converted barns and hastily constructed dormitories, separated by gender and age as Whitmore's doctrine required. Children attended classes in a one-room schoolhouse built near the compound center, while adults worked the fields and maintained the facilities. The community appeared to thrive under Whitmore's leadership. Visitors from town reported seeing well-dressed children playing in organized groups, their parents working diligently in vegetable gardens and workshops. The sanctuary produced high-quality furniture, textiles, and preserved foods that they sold at the weekly farmers market in nearby Millbrook. Local business owners praised the community's contributions to the regional economy. Hardware store owner James Patterson told the Herald in 1943 that sanctuary members were honest, hard-working folks who pay their bills on time and never cause trouble. The group's carpentry work, in particular, earned recognition throughout the county for its exceptional craftsmanship. Father Whitmore maintained cordial relationships with local authorities and neighboring farmers. He regularly invited Sheriff David Morrison for dinner at the compound, where they discussed community security and agricultural techniques. Morrison later testified that these visits always occurred in public areas with multiple witnesses present, and that he never observed anything irregular or concerning. The sanctuary's reputation for rehabilitating troubled families spread beyond Oregon's borders. Social workers from California, Washington, and Idaho began referring difficult cases to Whitmore's program. Court documents from the period show judges recommending the sanctuary as an alternative to traditional reform schools or mental institutions for families facing dissolution. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a prominent child psychologist from Portland, visited the compound in 1944 to evaluate their education. Her published report described remarkable progress among children who had previously been considered incorrigible or mentally deficient. She noted the children's unusual discipline and focus as evidence of Whitmore's innovative approaches to behavioral modification. The sanctuary's financial stability impressed local officials who had grown accustomed to transient religious groups struggling to survive. Bank records from Millbrook Savings and Trust show steady deposits throughout the 1940s, with substantial payments arriving monthly from unnamed benefactors in major cities. These funds allowed continuous expansion of facilities and programs. Construction projects proceeded regularly throughout the decade. Workers erected new dormitories, workshops, and agricultural buildings using lumber harvested from the property's extensive forests. The compound developed into a largely self-sufficient community, capable of housing over 200 residents, without relying on outside resources for basic necessities. Medical care within the sanctuary received particular attention from Father Whitmore, who had studied anatomy and physiology during his missionary work. He established an infirmary staffed by residents with previous medical training, including a former nurse from Seattle and a discharged Army medic. Local physicians rarely visited the compound, as Whitmore preferred to handle health matters internally. The community's isolation, initially viewed as temporary necessity, gradually became permanent policy. By 1945, residents rarely ventured beyond the compound's boundaries, except for essential business transactions. Whitmore explained this practice as protecting our spiritual progress from worldly contamination during his occasional sermons at Millbrook Methodist Church. Educational programs within the sanctuary emphasized practical skills alongside religious instruction. Children learned carpentry, agriculture, textile production, and food preservation under adult supervision. Academic subjects received less attention, with Whitmore arguing that spiritual wisdom held greater value than conventional scholarship for their particular community. The compound's success attracted additional families throughout the late 1940s. Records indicate that approximately 20 new families joined the community each year between 1945 and 1950, bringing the total population to nearly 300 residents. These newcomers arrived through referrals from previous members or recommendations from sympathetic social service agencies. Communication with the outside world became increasingly restricted as the community grew. Residents surrendered personal mail to Whitmore for review before sending or receiving correspondence. He explained this policy as necessary to prevent spiritual backsliding caused by negative influences from their former lives. Local authorities continued viewing the sanctuary favorably throughout this period. Sheriff Morrison's successor, Harold Stevens, maintained the tradition of regular visits and praised the community's remarkable transformation of troubled individuals into productive citizens. The county tax assessor consistently rated the property as well-maintained agricultural land in full compliance with local regulations. The Cascade Valley Herald published its final positive article about the sanctuary in December 1949, describing the community's Christmas celebration as a heartwarming example of Christian fellowship. Reporter Thomas Grant noted the genuine happiness visible among residents during the holiday festivities, particularly praising the children's choir performance. This golden period of public acceptance and apparent prosperity would soon end as subtle warning signs began emerging throughout 1950. However, the sanctuary's carefully cultivated reputation for spiritual rehabilitation and community service had created such strong goodwill that these early concerns would be dismissed or ignored for nearly a decade. The first documented complaint about the Eternal Light Sanctuary appeared in Sheriff Harold Stevens's files on March 15, 1951. Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, a resident of nearby Millbrook, reported that her sister's family had vanished without explanation after joining the religious community 6 months earlier. Stevens' handwritten notes described the conversation as routine family dispute and sister concerned about lack of contact. Mary Kellerman had arrived at the sanctuary in September 1950 with her husband Robert and 3 young children. According to Dorothy's statement, the family had been struggling financially after Robert lost his job at a Portland lumber mill. They viewed Whitmore's community as temporary refuge, while Robert recovered from what family members described as drinking problems and violent episodes. Dorothy Kellerman explained that her sister had promised to write weekly letters and visit for Christmas. When neither occurred, she had driven to the compound to inquire about Mary's well-being. Guards at the entrance gate informed her that Mary's family was undergoing intensive spiritual counseling and could not receive visitors until their program concluded. Sheriff Stevens contacted Father Whitmore by telephone the following day. According to his report, Whitmore expressed complete understanding of the sisters' concerns and explained that many families required temporary isolation from previous relationships to overcome destructive patterns. He offered to arrange a meeting once the Kellermans completed their current phase of rehabilitation. No such meeting ever occurred. Dorothy Kellerman returned to the sheriff's office twice in April 1951, demanding a welfare check on her sister's family. Stevens eventually drove to the compound himself, where Whitmore personally assured him that the Kellermans were progressing well in their spiritual journey, but still required several more months of intensive treatment before outside contact would be beneficial. Stevens' report describes his brief tour of the compound's public areas, where he observed normal agricultural and workshop activities. He noted that residents appeared well-fed and properly clothed, and showed appropriate respect for their spiritual leader. The sheriff concluded that Dorothy Kellerman's concerns stemmed from misunderstanding the family's voluntary commitment to the rehabilitation program. Similar complaints began accumulating throughout 1951 and 1952. The Millbrook Post Office reported that mail addressed to sanctuary residents increasingly returned as undeliverable or received no response. Postmaster Eugene Mitchell noted that families who had previously maintained regular correspondence with relatives suddenly stopped all communication after joining the community. Harrison Webb, the county's only physician, became concerned about the sanctuary's medical isolation policies. In June 1952, he requested permission to conduct routine health inspections of the compound's children as required by state law. Whitmore declined the visit, claiming that their internal medical staff provided superior care and that outside examinations would traumatize children recovering from. The Oregon Department of Health received Webb's formal complaint in August 1952. State investigator Janet Morrison visited the compound to assess compliance with child welfare regulations. Her report praised the excellent physical condition of children she observed noting their remarkable discipline and educational progress under challenging circumstances. Morrison's investigation, however, revealed several disturbing inconsistencies. The sanctuary's enrollment records showed 347 residents, including 128 children, but she had observed fewer than 50 individuals during her visit. When questioned about the discrepancy, Whitmore explained that many families were participating in remote prayer retreats in the compound's forested areas and could not be disturbed during their spiritual exercises. Local business owners began noticing changes in the sanctuary's purchasing patterns around this time. Hardware store owner James Patterson told the Herald that community representatives now bought unusual quantities of medical supplies, construction materials, and industrial equipment that seemed excessive for their stated agricultural activities. They also requested large amounts of lime, which Patterson found peculiar for farming operations. The compound's garbage disposal methods attracted attention from sanitation workers who serviced other rural properties in the area. Driver Albert Morrison reported that the sanctuary produced virtually no household waste, despite housing hundreds of residents. He speculated that they either burned everything or transported refuse elsewhere, which violated county disposal regulations. Strange sounds emanating from the compound during nighttime hours prompted complaints from neighboring farmers. William Hendricks, whose property bordered the sanctuary's eastern fence, reported hearing organized chanting or singing that continued for hours after midnight. He described the sounds as unlike normal hymns or prayers, and noted that they occurred with increasing frequency throughout 1953. The most disturbing report came from teenage siblings Emma and Thomas Bradley, whose family farm was located 3 miles from the compound. In September 1953, they told their parents about discovering freshly dug areas in the forest near the sanctuary's boundary during a hunting expedition. The locations appeared to be recently disturbed graves, covered with branches and marked with crude wooden crosses. Robert Bradley, the children's father, initially dismissed their claims as imagination. However, when the teenagers provided detailed descriptions of multiple burial sites and offered to guide adults to the locations, he contacted Sheriff Stevens. The sheriff's report describes his visit to the area with the Bradley children as inconclusive due to natural forest disturbances and animal activity. Stevens did note finding several areas of loose soil that appeared recently excavated. When questioned about possible burial activities on sanctuary property, Father Whitmore explained that community members maintained small memorial gardens to honor deceased family members from their previous lives. He characterized these sites as therapeutic spaces for grief processing, rather than actual graves. The explanation satisfied Stevens, who had grown comfortable with Whitmore's unconventional but seemingly effective methods. His report concluded that the burial sites represented harmless religious practices that pose no threat to public safety. He recommended no further investigation into the matter. Dr. Webb's concerns about the compound's medical practices intensified after treating several former residents who had left the community under suspicious circumstances. In October 1953, he examined Janet Rogers, who had escaped from the sanctuary with severe malnutrition and untreated injuries. Rogers claimed that residents received inadequate food and medical care, particularly children who violated community rules. Rogers' testimony described a rigid hierarchy within the compound, with Father Whitmore exercising absolute control over daily activities. Residents worked 12-hour shifts in agriculture and manufacturing operations, with minimal breaks for meals or rest. Children attended brief educational sessions focused primarily on religious indoctrination rather than academic subjects. Most disturbing were Rogers' accounts of punishment procedures for residents who questioned Whitmore's authority or violated community regulations. She described corrections sessions involving physical abuse, sensory deprivation, and forced isolation in underground chambers. These punishments allegedly continued until subjects demonstrated complete compliance with institutional demands. Sheriff Stevens interviewed Rogers about her allegations, but found her testimony inconsistent and unreliable due to obvious psychological disturbance. His report noted that Rogers had a history of mental health problems and suggested that her claims resulted from paranoid delusions rather than factual experiences. No formal investigation followed her testimony. The final warning sign emerged in November 1953 when state employment investigators discovered that the sanctuary had been collecting federal assistance payments for families who had supposedly left the community months earlier. Caseworker Linda Murphy found that 17 families continued receiving support checks, despite having no verified addresses or contact information since joining Whitmore's program. Murphy's investigation revealed that someone had been forging signatures on government documents and redirecting assistance payments to accounts controlled by the sanctuary. When confronted with this evidence, Whitmore claimed that former residents had authorized him to collect their benefits until they established independent lives after completing rehabilitation. He provided no documentation supporting these arrangements. Despite mounting evidence of irregularities, local and state authorities remained reluctant to challenge the sanctuary's operations directly. Whitmore's reputation as a spiritual leader, combined with political pressure to avoid interfering with religious communities, created protective barriers around the compound. The accumulating complaints and suspicious circumstances would be systematically ignored until a horrific discovery finally forced official action. On April 3, 1962, 2 Oregon State Police detectives arrived at the Eternal Light Sanctuary with a federal warrant to investigate allegations of tax evasion, and what they discovered would become one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American religious history, exposing decades of systematic murder, abuse, and psychological torture disguised as spiritual rehabilitation. Detective Lieutenant James Harrison and Sergeant Robert Collins had expected to find financial irregularities and possibly some evidence of cult-like control over residents. Instead, they encountered a nearly abandoned compound with only 12 emaciated survivors hiding in the main dormitory building, all showing signs of severe malnutrition and psychological trauma. The survivors initially refused to speak with investigators, cowering in corners and exhibiting behaviors consistent with extreme conditioning. Dr. Patricia Nelson, a psychiatrist brought in to assist with interviews, noted that the individuals demonstrated classic symptoms of prolonged psychological torture, including learned helplessness, dissociation, and selective mutism. After 3 days of patient interviewing, survivor Margaret Chen began providing coherent testimony about conditions within the sanctuary. Her account, recorded on multiple tape reels that were later sealed by court order, detailed 22 years of escalating abuse orchestrated by Father Marcus Whitmore and his inner circle of trusted assistants. Chen had arrived at the compound in 1955 with her husband David and infant daughter Susan. Like most families, they had been recruited through social service agencies that viewed the sanctuary as a legitimate rehabilitation program for troubled households. Chen described their initial months as relatively normal compared to the horrors that would follow as Whitmore's true methods emerged. According to Chen's testimony, new families underwent a gradual process of isolation and indoctrination designed to break down their psychological resistance. Initially, they were housed in comfortable dormitories and allowed limited contact with the outside world while participating in agricultural work and relief. The first phase of conditioning involved separation of family members into different housing units based on age and gender. Whitmore justified this practice as necessary for overcoming unhealthy family dynamics that had contributed to their previous problems. Parents were told that temporary separation would allow both adults and children to develop independent spiritual. Children were moved to specialized dormitories, supervised by trusted community members who had undergone advanced spiritual training. Parents were permitted brief, supervised visits with their offspring, but were discouraged from forming excessive emotional attachments that might interfere with the children's spiritual development. Chen described watching her daughter Susan gradually transform from a happy, energetic child into a withdrawn, frightened individual who barely acknowledged her mother's presence during their increasingly rare meetings. When Chen expressed concerns about her daughter's condition, she was assigned additional correction sessions designed to eliminate her possessive maternal instincts. The correction sessions, conducted in underground chambers beneath the main administrative building, involved techniques that Chen could only partially remember due to the psychological trauma they induced. She recalled being confined in complete darkness for days at a time, subjected to loud sounds and extreme temperatures, and forced to recite religious passages until she lost consciousness from exhaustion. Physical abuse accompanied the psychological conditioning, with resistors receiving beatings that left permanent injuries. Chen showed investigators scars on her arms and legs from restraints used during correction sessions, as well as evidence of malnutrition from the punitive food restriction policies imposed on uncooperative residents. More disturbing were Chen's accounts of what happened to families who attempted to leave the compound or contacted outside authorities about conditions within the sanctuary. She described witnessing the systematic elimination of entire households who had expressed doubts about Whitmore's methods or requested permission to depart. The murders, according to Chen's testimony, were carried out by Whitmore's most trusted followers, using methods designed to appear as accidents or suicides. Victims were typically drugged during evening meals, then suffocated or strangled while unconscious. Their bodies were buried in remote areas of the compound's extensive forest holdings. Chen specifically recalled the disappearance of the Morrison family in 1958. Robert Morrison had been secretly communicating with his brother in Portland about escape plans when Whitmore discovered the correspondence. Within days, Morrison, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 children had committed suicide, according to official community announcements, unable to cope with their spiritual inadequacies. The bodies were never shown to other residents, who were told that the family had requested private burial to avoid contaminating others with their spiritual failure. Similar explanations accompanied dozens of other disappearances over the years, creating an atmosphere of terror that prevented survivors from questioning Whitmore's authority. Detective Harrison's search of the compound's administrative buildings uncovered extensive documentation of these crimes. Whitmore had maintained detailed records of each family's progression through his rehabilitation program, including psychological evaluations, punishment schedules, and ultimately their method of elimination when they proved irredeemable. The files contained photographs of victims before and after their conditioning, showing the dramatic physical deterioration that occurred during their time at the sanctuary. Medical charts documented malnutrition, untreated injuries, and evidence of systematic abuse spanning years of captivity. Most damning were Whitmore's personal journals, discovered in a hidden safe behind his office bookshelf. These handwritten volumes revealed the true purpose of the sanctuary, not spiritual rehabilitation, but psychological experimentation designed to test methods of total. Whitmore had been developing techniques for breaking down individual identity and creating completely compliant subjects. The journals described specific procedures for inducing psychological dependence, eliminating family bonds, and conditioning victims to accept their own destruction as spiritual necessity. Whitmore viewed his residents as laboratory subjects in his quest to understand the limits of human psychology. FBI behavioral analysts who later reviewed the journals characterized Whitmore's methods as among the most sophisticated and systematic approaches to psychological torture documented in criminal history. The techniques showed influences from wartime interrogation methods, experimental psychology research, and religious indoctrination practices combined into a uniquely horrific system of human destruction. The physical evidence discovered at the compound supported Chen's testimony about the systematic murders. Ground-penetrating radar revealed 47 burial sites scattered throughout the property's forest areas, exactly matching the locations described by survivors. Each grave contained multiple bodies, suggesting that entire families had been eliminated simultaneously. Forensic examination of the remains showed evidence of prolonged abuse before death. Many skeletons exhibited signs of malnutrition, untreated fractures, and trauma consistent with torture. Children's remains were particularly disturbing, showing evidence of medical experimentation and surgical procedures performed without proper medical training or equipment. The recovery operation continued for 3 months as investigators systematically excavated burial sites and documented evidence of the crimes. The final count revealed 127 victims buried on the property, representing approximately 38 families who had been murdered over the course of Whitmore's operation. Additional searches of the compound's buildings revealed torture chambers, medical experimentation facilities, and areas used for psychological conditioning that confirmed survivors' accounts of the systematic abuse. The sophistication of these installations suggested long-term planning and significant financial investment in creating optimal conditions for human experimentation. By July 1962, investigators had assembled overwhelming evidence of the crimes committed at the Eternal Light Sanctuary. However, the primary perpetrator had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his victims, his documentation, and 12 severely traumatized survivors who would spend years recovering from their experiences in what the press would call America's Chamber of Horrors. The manhunt for Father Marcus Whitmore began immediately after investigators discovered the mass graves at the Eternal Light Sanctuary. FBI agents traced his movements to a small airfield near Eugene, Oregon, where witnesses reported seeing a man matching his description boarding a private aircraft on April 1, 1962, 2 days before the compound raid. The plane's flight plan indicated a destination of Vancouver, British Columbia, but Canadian authorities found no record of Whitmore's arrival. Intelligence agencies later speculated that he had established escape routes and false identities years in advance, possibly with assistance from unknown benefactors who had funded the sanctuary's operations throughout its existence. Despite an international manhunt involving Interpol and multiple law enforcement agencies, Whitmore was never located. Unconfirmed sightings placed him in South America, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe over the following decades, but none were substantiated. The FBI maintained an active warrant for his arrest until 1995, when the case was transferred to their cold case division. The 12 survivors of the sanctuary required extensive medical and psychological treatment before they could provide coherent testimony about their experiences. Dr. Patricia Nelson, who supervised their rehabilitation, described their condition as the most severe case of institutional trauma she had encountered in 20 years of psychiatric practice. Margaret Chen, the most articulate survivor, spent 18 months in psychiatric care before she could function independently. Her daughter, Susan, who had been 8 years old when the family joined the sanctuary, required intensive therapy to recover suppressed memories and develop normal social relationships. Many of the specific details about Whitmore's methods came from Susan's gradually recovered recollections. The other survivors experienced varying degrees of psychological damage, with several never fully recovering their ability to function in normal society. 3 individuals remained in institutional care for the rest of their lives, unable to overcome the conditioning they had experienced during their captivity at the compound. Local authorities faced intense criticism for their failure to investigate earlier warnings about the sanctuary's operations. Sheriff Harold Stevens, who had dismissed multiple complaints over the years, submitted his resignation in August 1962. His successor, William Martinez, implemented new protocols for investigating reports of institutional abuse, but the damage to public trust in law enforcement had been severe. The Oregon Department of Health conducted an internal investigation into how their inspectors had failed to detect evidence of the systematic abuse. Inspector Janet Morrison, who had praised the sanctuary's facilities in her 1952 report, was found to have accepted bribes from Whitmore in exchange for favorable evaluations. She received a prison sentence of 8 years for corruption and obstruction of justice. Federal agencies launched broader investigations into the network of social service organizations that had referred families to the sanctuary. These inquiries revealed that several agencies had received payments for directing troubled families to Whitmore's program, creating a pipeline of vulnerable victims for his experiments. The findings led to congressional hearings on the regulation of religious communities and child welfare programs. Senator Richard Hayes of Oregon chaired the investigating committee, which documented systematic failures in oversight that had allowed the sanctuary to operate undetected for over 2 decades. However, the hearings produced limited reforms due to political pressure from religious organizations concerned about government interference in their operations. The final congressional report recommended improved coordination between agencies, but avoided mandatory oversight requirements that might have prevented similar tragedies. Media coverage of the sanctuary crimes was heavily restricted by court orders designed to protect the privacy of survivors and prevent copycat incidents. Most newspaper accounts provided only basic facts about the number of victims and the nature of the crimes, without detailed descriptions of Whitmore's methods or the condition of the survivors. The Cascade Valley Herald, which had published glowing reports about the sanctuary throughout the 1940s, printed a single article about the discovery of the mass graves. Editor Thomas Grant, who had written several positive pieces about the community, declined to comment on his publication's role in legitimizing Whitmore's operation. Several families of victims attempted to file lawsuits against the county and state agencies that had failed to investigate earlier complaints about the sanctuary. However, most cases were dismissed due to statutes of limitations and governmental immunity provisions. Only 2 families received modest settlements in exchange for agreeing not to discuss the details of their cases publicly. The compound itself was demolished in 1963 after extensive documentation of the crime scenes. The Oregon State Police retained key evidence from the torture chambers and burial sites, but most of the buildings were destroyed to prevent the location from becoming a macabre tourist attraction. The property was eventually sold to a timber company that clear-cut the forested areas where victims had been buried. New growth has since covered the landscape, leaving no visible traces of the crimes that occurred there. County records show that the land was later subdivided for residential development, with no indication of its horrific history. Psychological research into Whitmore's methods was classified by federal authorities due to concerns that the techniques could be adapted for intelligence or military applications. Dr. Raymond Foster, who analyzed the conditioning procedures, noted that they represented significant advances in understanding human psychological manipulation that raised serious ethical questions about their potential uses. The classified research remained sealed until 1995, when portions were released under Freedom of Information Act requests. Even then, substantial sections were redacted to protect what authorities described as sensitive information related to national security. The full extent of Whitmore's psychological discoveries may never be publicly known. Margaret Chen died in 1987 at the age of 54, having spent her final years advocating for improved oversight of religious institutions and child welfare programs. Her daughter Susan became a social worker specializing in cult rehabilitation, helping other survivors of institutional abuse recover from their experiences. The other known survivors lived quiet lives under assumed identities provided by federal authorities. Several died relatively young from health problems related to their abuse, while others struggled with chronic mental illness and substance abuse throughout their lives. None ever spoke publicly about their experiences at the sanctuary. In 2010, investigative journalist Rachel Martinez attempted to write a comprehensive account of the sanctuary crimes, but her research was hampered by sealed court records and the reluctance of authorities to discuss the case. Her book proposal was rejected by multiple publishers who cited concerns about legal liability and the sensitivity of the subject matter. The Oregon Historical Society maintains a brief entry about the Eternal Light Sanctuary in their archives, describing it simply as a religious community that operated from 1940 to 1962, with no mention of the crimes committed there. Requests for more detailed information are typically referred to law enforcement agencies that no longer maintain active files on the case. Today, few residents of Cascade County remember the sanctuary or its crimes. The area has been developed with suburban housing and small businesses that serve the growing population of Portland commuters. Nothing marks the location where 127 innocent people were murdered by a man who promised them spiritual salvation, but delivered only suffering and death. The question of how many other operations similar to Whitmore's may have existed remains unanswered. His journals referenced correspondence with individuals operating similar research programs in other locations, but these references were too vague to generate productive investigations. The true scope of this network of institutionalized abuse may never be known. Father Marcus Whitmore, if still alive, would be 130 years old today. More likely, he died decades ago in some, taking his secrets and the identities of his collaborators with him. The families he destroyed, the children he tortured, and the communities he betrayed deserve better than this silence. But justice remains as elusive now as it was. If this story has shaken you to your core, if you've made it this far, it's because you understand that these buried truths need to see the light. Let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. We want to see how far these forgotten stories are reaching, how many people still care about the voices that were silenced, and if you believe these hidden chapters of history deserve to be remembered, subscribe to the channel. There are so many other cases the world tried to erase, but we refuse to let them disappear into the darkness.